Hello and a huge welcome to all of those joining us for the final webinar of 2019 in the Maiden Voyage, Your Best Travel Self webinar series on bleisure travel. This is an area which is growing massively. Employees of today want to take advantage of these opportunities when traveling, and who can blame them? But of course, there are many considerations for the employee and the employer alike. We've got some great content for you all to benefit from and give you food for thought in today's webinar. Just to introduce myself, my name's Erica and I am the Operations Manager here at Maiden Voyage. I'm going to facilitate this webinar and all of the polls for you, and of course Carolyn and Matthew will be your expert speakers today. I know they're very much looking forward to speaking with you very soon. We're absolutely delighted that the Maiden Voyage webinar series is sponsored by Chubb. I just want to share a little bit of background on them. Chubb is a leader in delivering carefully designed insurance and risk management programs that support clients with their duty of care obligations. Within their extensive selection of commercial products, they offer a well-balanced range of solutions covering business travel and group personal accident, which deliver peace of mind for large multinational organisations through to small and medium enterprises. So they are absolutely a natural fit for co-delivering today's webinar. For those of you who don't know about Maiden Voyage so well, we provide global solutions to help organisations safeguard their female and LGBTQ+ business travellers. In a competitive world, companies want to attract the best talent, no matter what gender or background they have. However, some personal characteristics are at an increased risk when travelling. So companies need to do what they can to educate those individuals, to mitigate risk and fulfil their duty of care, something I'm sure you're all very aware of. A little bit of essential housekeeping to cover for you. This webinar will last an hour. It is being recorded, and a copy of this recording will be shared with you following this session and will be available for a limited amount of time. Slides are copyright of Maiden Voyage and Chubb, and there will be a few polls released throughout this session, so please do be responsive to these. Now, everyone's different and is going to have different experiences, and therefore, if you've got a particular question, we'd encourage you to ask those through the question box and submit that. If you would like to remain anonymous, please also state that in the box. You should see that in your control panel. So I know that we're all super busy, but please do allow yourself this hour to invest in your quest to become your best travel self. So let me give you some background on our expert speakers today. So Carolyn Pearson is the founder and CEO of Maiden Voyage. She is a regular speaker on the subject of female and LGBTQ+ travel safety, and she sits on the Global Business Travel Association Risk Committee, also known as the GBTA Committee. Carolyn is herself an avid bleisure traveller, and she in fact invented Maiden Voyage during a bleisure trip to LA. Matthew Strasberg, he joined Chubb in 2012, and he has held both actuarial, underwriting and strategy roles within the accident and health business in the New York, London, Singapore and Miami offices. During his tenure, Matthew has played a key role in building Chubb's travel insurance business. As an individual with a background and passion in both the actuarial and travel industries, Matthew combines analytical expertise with deep knowledge of the travel world. He is a true world citizen and has visited over 70 countries. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Carolyn, and Matthew is going to join us later on in the presentation.
Thank you, Erica. It's a delight to be here today. I'm just going to quickly run through the agenda. So before we do that, I just want to reiterate what Erica said, that it's a very interesting subject, something that's on the top of everybody's mind these days. And we've hopefully brought together for you today the latest thinking and multiple sources of information to make this as comprehensive as we possibly could. So we're going to start by looking at what bleisure travel actually is. We're going to have a look at some trends and how bleisure travel has evolved over the years. We're going to look at the risks and benefits of bleisure travel for both employees and employers. We're going to, of course, explore what happens when things go wrong. And as a bleisure traveller, we're going to help you get the most of a bleisure trip. As an employer, we'll be looking at understanding what the solutions are to help you to support your organisation and your travellers. And of course, we would be taking some time to look at policies and your employer obligations. And there will be some time at the end for questions, so feel free to write these down and we'll come to them at the end of the session. So I'm just going to start by running a poll. So what we'd like to know is what your role is within your organisation.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to release that poll for you now. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to respond to those. We've got a number of options available. Travel manager, security professional, are you in HR or learning and development? Or do you fall into the other bracket? Or are you a regular business traveller? I'll give that a few seconds. Okay, and I'm going to close that poll now. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I'm just sharing those results. So 5% travel manager, 76% fall in the other bracket.
Oh, wow.
So that's fantastic. So thank you very much for responding to that.
I'll be interested to know what the other are, but I'm sure we'll find that out in the questions later. One more poll for you before we jump in. Do you actually know what bleisure travel means? So obviously, yes, if you do, no, if you don't. If you think you do, then you can also select that option.
Those votes are coming in. Fantastic. Okay, so that's really interesting. I'm going to close that. A few more seconds. Fantastic. Okay, so that's great. So we've got 52% say yes, and 35% say I think so, and 13% say no.
Okay.
So really good mix there.
Okay. Well, simply, what bleisure travel is just a combination of business and leisure time. And so let's have a look at some examples of what a bleisure trip may constitute. So it could be, for example, tagging a weekend onto the end of a business trip. It could be taking a longer holiday, maybe at the beginning or at the end of a trip. It may well be, if you're very lucky, visiting one of your favourite bucket list destinations. It may also be that you'd like to take friends or family with you when you're going on a business trip. Or it may be whilst you're actually away, you pop off for an afternoon or an evening to visit a historical or a heritage site, or just go off and see something like an art gallery, for example. It could be that you've always wanted to do a particular sport or a challenge. So, for example, if you happen to be on a business trip in New Zealand, you maybe always wanted to go bungee jumping. It may just simply be visiting a spa, or we could even argue that dining out in your own time could be perceived as a bleisure activity. So what we're going to do is jump into one more poll just to find out if you yourself have bleisure travellers within your organisation.
Okay, so let's have a look. So do you have bleisure travellers within your organisation? If you're a bleisure traveller yourself, please select yes. Okay, so as expected, really, really high. So I'm going to close that vote now. Okay, and share those responses. So you can see that 89% absolutely do have bleisure travellers or are indeed bleisure travellers. 11% say no.
Okay. Well, in fact, what we do know from our research is that 1 in 4 organisations haven't considered bleisure when they're producing their travel policies. So again, we're going to be coming back to you for one more poll. We want to know if you have any policies in place within your organisation to support bleisure travel. And if you aren't sure, of course, you can just select no.
Okay, that's launched now. So do you have a policy in place to support the practice of bleisure travel? Okay, a few more seconds on there. I'm going to close that now and share those responses. So you can see there, so 47% say yes and 53% say no. Okay.
There's quite a lot who do. Great, thank you. Okay, so let's just have a look at who our bleisure travellers are, or who your bleisure travellers are. What we can see here is that 90% of millennials have at some point participated on a bleisure activity whilst they've been travelling. as opposed to 81% Gen Xers and 80% baby boomers. So in fact, there is quite a cross section of people who are participating in leisure activities when they're away from home. So let's have a look at what they're doing and how they're doing it. First of all, as Erica said at the beginning of today's session, is that leisure travel is something that is booming and it is growing. And in fact, 60% of business trips, according to Expedia Media Solutions, have turned into a leisure trip, which is a really high number. In terms of where leisure travel happens, we can see here that there's an almost equal split of domestic versus international trips turning into a leisure trip. And also, if we have a look at the breakdown in terms of duration, then according to this research, when a leisure element is added to a business trip, the duration of that trip can almost double. So let's have a look at the proximity to home in terms of where people are more likely, or when people are more likely to participate in a leisure activity. And as we can see on the chart here, if you look over to that big blue 49%, we can see that the long haul trips are the ones that are more likely to convert into a leisure trip rather than, say, somebody popping domestically to a city just a couple of 100 miles away from where their main office is. So why might people participate in a leisure trip? Well, again, according to Expedia, here we can see that there's great entertainment or activity within that city. It could be a bucket list destination, which I mentioned, or just a really easy city to get around. So cities such as London, New York, Tokyo, Singapore are really common destinations. And of course, as I mentioned, if you've been requested to travel to a bucket list destination, then perfect for you to add that extra time on, or travellers to add that extra time on to visit that destination. So what we can see here are a number of benefits, both to the employer and to the employee. And so what we can see is, increased productivity, and that's maybe after a business trip, but also during a business trip as well, because somebody's had that time to just take some time out. And what we've seen from lots of research is that actually leisure time away has improved mental health for those people who have been traveling. So that's taking some downtime and not just working to full velocity whilst they're away. But also it gives that better connection and that better understanding with the local population. If you imagine yourself or a number of your travellers are taking time to get out, to meet with the locals, to eat the local food, to maybe participate in some of the local activities, it means that they can also connect better with the people who they're going to be doing business with, because they can talk about things that they have done in that area. And certainly I know from my experience when I've travelled on business and taken some time out, that the locals love the fact that you've taken time to integrate with their region. But of course, that may well lead to better sleep. It could mean that people are going to get more exercise or better physical health. If you think about someone who's taken a long haul flight, if they've got some downtime just to relax and recoup before they jump into the business activities, then they're going to feel better. But also, as Erica has said, business travellers are now looking to see what employers are offering in terms of benefits. And we know that actually offering leisure travel to your staff is potentially going to help you to attract that right type of talent. It also may well lead to reduced travel costs. So if we remember, for example, that some flights may be cheaper if somebody stays a Saturday night, then you may be able to get some of your travellers to consider staying over that period to get cheaper flight costs. But we also know that looking in different areas, doing different things, merging into different cultures will stimulate that creative thinking. And I certainly know that I get some of my best ideas when I'm away from the office, and I have got different stimulus than what I have when I'm looking at the four walls of the office. But also for your employees, it provides affordable holiday opportunities and just that ability to adjust to the new time zones as well. I certainly remember that when I created Maiden Voyage on my business trip to Los Angeles, I'd actually taken the weekend prior to my meetings to have that downtime, but also to make sure that I wasn't really tired and jet lagged for my meetings ahead. And then, of course, as we've talked about, that ability to bring friends and family members along on a business trip just reduces the stress, but also maintains that family connection as well. But of course, for every upside, there are going to be some downsides, and things can and do go wrong. And so if not properly managed, or if you have any experienced travellers who are sort of finding their way with regards to leisure travel, then things that you might consider, or things that we have got evidence of, is that poor time management, where individuals really struggle to segregate between their work and their leisure activities. And so it may be that they're skipping out of work to do a leisure activity, they're late back. It could be that they are actually skipping work altogether to go off and do a leisure activity. And we're going to look at some specific examples of that as we dive into the material. There may well be undisclosed leisure travel segments or activities as well. So that could be somebody's extending a trip or participating in an activity that you don't know about, which could well lead to some situations where there could be injury or things going wrong, or theft, or different types of crime, because people aren't really prepared for those leisure elements. But also what we find is that quite often when people are traveling on business, in the main, they're quite well looked after. So they may be traveling with, a good standard of airline, maybe staying in a good standard hotel. You may be providing chauffeur transfers, but actually during those leisure elements, people tend to sometimes go for lower, cheaper cost options, which may well have those lower safety standards. But also, if you've got travellers heading off on a leisure element of a trip, and you may or may not know about it, there aren't any risk assessments which are performed, either for the accommodation that they're staying in, the transportation providers that they're using, or of course the leisure activities that they're going to participate in. And we all know that people have got different levels of spontaneity, so indeed it may not even be possible to provide prior risk assessments if somebody suddenly decides they're going to do something because they've read about it on a local tourist flyer. But it also may be that some of your travellers are doing things which aren't covered by insurance, and particularly if they're not disclosing what they're doing prior to taking that trip. So there are some real duty of care grey areas that need to be really brought to light, so that both the employer and the employee understand where that risk lay. And of course, we've got employees who may well fail in their duty of loyalty, and I'm going to talk it in more detail as to what duty of loyalty is. But there also may well be negative connotations or envy from colleagues. So that may be that people feel that, people are going on a business trip, they may well see it as a jolly, and if somebody is taking some downtime because it's going to assist with their integration or their mental wellness or their physical wellness, then that envy from colleagues could create a negative atmosphere within the workforce. But again, that could then drive leisure activities underground. Now, I talked about undisclosed leisure elements, and what we know is that actually 64% of business travellers have extended their business trips for personal or leisure time, and they've done so secretly without actually telling their co-workers, their boss, or even their spouse or partner. So that's quite a high number, isn't it? So I'm going to talk about a couple of cases where things have gone dramatically wrong. I'm going to talk first of all about a case of a gentleman called Spencer Vaughan. Spencer was working in the military, and he suffered a broken neck during an adventure expedition trip in Gran Canaria. He conducted a shallow dive into the sea, and that he suffered devastating consequences, because as a result of that dive, he was actually paralysed. Now, he made a claim against the Ministry of Defence, but on this occasion, the courts found that they weren't liable for his accident because it had not happened during the course of his employment. So whilst he was away on an adventure training course, he'd actually been given some downtime, he dove into the sea, he had an accident, and after a protracted court case, he actually lost his claim for damages. Now, I'm going to share with you another example of a gentleman who was also injured whilst on a military expedition. And this gentleman was a man called Charles Radcliffe. And Charles was away with a group of colleagues, and he suffered a broken back after jumping 65 feet into a reservoir from a bridge. Now, the reason that he jumped off the bridge into the reservoir was because as a senior officer in the Irish Guards, one of his colleagues actually told him to show his troops that he wasn't scared to jump off the bridge. And he said it would be bad form if he wasn't going to do that with the rest of his colleagues. And Charles actually felt pressured to jump. And also, in his defence, he said he was not refused permission by his superior to do the jump. On that occasion, he made the jump safely, but the following day, he decided that it was time to show his men how to do it, and he leapt again from the same bridge, but this time with catastrophic consequences. The MOD claimed that Lieutenant Radcliffe was off duty at the time of the accident and was a voluntary author of his own misfortune. Although the officers and the men were relaxing off duty, rank and military discipline remained relevant. And the fundamental principle learned at Sandhurst was that an officer is always responsible for his men. So because Charles had been given permission and actively encouraged by his superior to make the jump, the judges upheld an earlier court ruling that the MOD was 60% to blame for the accident. Lieutenant Radcliffe was 40% to blame. And even though his damages were reduced accordingly by that split, the extent of his injuries meant that his payout was significant. So when I talked earlier regarding legal grey areas, you can see that these two cases are extremely similar, but in fact different consequences for both the employer and the employee. So quite devastating examples of when things have gone wrong on a bleisure element of a business trip or a work-related trip. Now, if you are a bleisure traveller, this next section is for you. We've had a look at the travel from the perspective of the employer. What we're going to be looking at now is how you can get the most of the bleisure elements of your business trips. So we're going to switch back to another poll. So if we do have bleisure travellers on here, then please feel free to tell us what you would typically do during that bleisure element of your trip. And if the technology works correctly, you should be able to select multiple options.
Okay, so that's available for you to vote now. So you've got a number of options there. You may do a selection of those. So do select all that apply. If you are indeed a bleisure traveller. So those votes are coming in, fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, I'll give it a couple more seconds. People like doing things when they're on their bleisure.
I can absolutely identify with that.
Right, okay, so let's close that now. Okay, and I'm going to share those responses with you. So you can see there, so 71%, oh, they do extend it for city breaks, 81% on sightseeing, various other activities, and extend for a longer holiday. So really interesting stats there, Caroline.
People after my own heart there absolutely love travel anyway, but just that extending that trip does make it all the more fulfilling, doesn't it? I know personally, you know, as we mentioned, Maiden Voyage was created when I was on a bleisure trip in LA. I've caught up with friends in Amsterdam, I've visited spas, I always visit a really nice yoga studio and a Vietnamese spa when I'm over in Silicon Valley. I visited hotels, you know, when I've been actually on a holiday, I've done some work as well, so reverse bleisure, where I've gone off and done some work-related activities whilst I've been on a little holiday. And when I worked in technology, I managed to get out to see the Taj Mahal whilst I was in India. And I'm looking forward to a bleisure trip next week, actually, in Oslo. So absolutely, I do love a good bleisure trip. I'm with you there. Okay, so how can you get the most of your bleisure trip? I'm sure that many of you, you seem like you're fairly experienced bleisure travellers anyway. I've done this and you've got probably a lot of these ideas under your belt, but just some things to think about, of course, is managing that budget. Because as I talked about, when your business is sending you overseas, you maybe get a better standard accommodation than what you might get if you're paying for it yourself. But things that you might be able to do, obviously, is your organisation will possibly use a travel management company. So you may be able to get the hotel that you're staying at for business extended for your leisure element of your stay as well. And of course, many of you will be using the sharing economy, so you might be using services such as Airbnb, or you might be switching to Uber or Lyft. You might be switching to public transport rather than using chauffeur-driven cars. And of course, if you are lucky enough to be able to use frequent flyer points or loyalty points, that means that you can get some really good deals in terms of getting some nice hotels, or getting some maybe internal flights or flights off to different areas when you're in a particular region. So you can really make the most of the time when you're traveling. But of course, I did mention that sometimes going down a couple of notches on budget may well increase that risk. So if you can make use of any of the corporate travel discounts or the loyalty points, then hopefully you can still continue to travel at quite a good standard. And of course, lots of areas to get the activities and inspiration. So if you're working for a company that's got a lot of international offices, you might have some local colleagues in that region, or you maybe have colleagues based where you're based who've traveled to that region, so they can give you some tips on things that they did during their Bleisure trips. And of course, many travel websites and articles, and indeed social media groups. And in fact, at Maiden Voyage, we've got over 90 ambassadors in predominantly business cities around the world that you can tap into, and maybe just speak to them regarding inspiration and things to do in their local areas that aren't always on the tourist track, but still some good insider tips and knowledge that you can make use of. So let's just think about the safety elements of your Bleisure trip. And so things that I would like you to think about, of course, are what are the inherent safety risks in the destination that you're traveling to. If you're traveling, you're going to extend a business trip to a destination where you've been on business, so maybe you're going to New York or London or Paris, then your organization's probably given you some pre-trip information. And if you're lucky enough to be using a travel risk management provider, then hopefully you'll have the country report or the destination report that you can read before you travel. But of course, if you're going to be visiting some remote areas, so maybe you're heading off into the countryside or off to the beach, make sure you do some research into the safety aspects of that particular area. But also, how are you going to stay in contact with your loved ones? Are you going to have mobile connectivity? I know I certainly traveled to French Polynesia last year, and I didn't have a compatible network with my mobile phone provider, and that's something that caught me out. So double check that if you are traveling to a region that is potentially off the beaten track, that you are going to get mobile coverage there or some kind of Wi-Fi coverage. But also, if things go wrong, it's probably really clear if you're on a business trip who you need to call, what the protocol is, who are you going to call if things go wrong during that leisure element. And do you understand what your employer will do for you and what they won't do for you? So that might include what's covered in your travel insurance, and does your travel insurance, your company travel insurance, include a leisure element, or have you got your personal travel insurance to cover that section of the trip? And Matt's going to be talking specifically around insurance products shortly. But also, are you going to be doing any extreme sports? Are you going off-piste? I, on my trip to French Polynesia, went swimming with sharks, and Matt can answer the question as he gets into his material as to whether or not swimming with sharks is covered under a standard policy. I suspect not. You may also be using dating apps. You know, again, something that's perfectly possible and potentially very, very safe where you are. But of course, think about the cultural differences in the destination that you're traveling to. We have had some incidents of drink spiking and also some entrapment for members of the LGBTQ community. So making sure that those apps are safe to use in those destinations. And again, if you're bringing family members or friends along with you, are they covered? Are they covered by the correct insurance? If something goes wrong, does your company offer a service whereby they will support them as well, or would they need to have extra provisions in place? So I talked briefly about duty of loyalty. Now, what duty of loyalty is an employee's obligation towards your organisation to refrain from any activities or behaviours on a business trip that would be contrary to their employer's best interest. So it's pretty much well understood, I think, within the employer community, but sometimes employees aren't aware of their obligations. So it's not just about those legal obligations, but making sure that they don't put themselves at risk, they don't put their colleagues at risk, but they don't also bring the reputation of the organisation into review as well. So things that employees or yourself might participate in, which may be borderline breaching that duty of loyalty. We see here on this piece of research done by On Call International, actually, that 27% of business travellers have admitted to binge drinking when they've been away on duty. 8% have lied to their employers about their activities. 4% have actually been detained by law enforcement officers, and 11% have said that they've picked up a stranger in a bar. Now, if you can imagine, we've seen plenty of examples of where people have participated in some of these behaviours whilst wearing a company uniform or wearing an employee's badge with their name on. So whilst they might think that they're in their downtime and nobody can stop them doing what they're doing in their own time, if they're actually doing something to identify your organisation, then that's going to have a negative impact potentially on your company's reputation. So what we really want employees to be thinking about is the reputation of your organisation, behaving with discretion, keeping themselves and their colleagues safe, and of course not wearing anything which is going to identify them or link them back to an organisation if they're doing anything which may not be appropriate. Now I'm going to be handing over to Matt, and Matt's going to help us, Matthew is going to help us to understand the different products and services that employers are going to use to ensure the safety of their business travellers and themselves as organisation.
Fantastic, Matthew. Are you here to join us?
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Erica. It's a privilege to be here with all of you. I'm going to start by asking a poll question. And the poll question is, and this is a poll question that's going to lead into the conversation that we're about to have on risk considerations and insurance. The poll question is, what services do you currently have in place at your organization? Do you have business travel insurance, assistance services provided to your employees, or both?
Okay, so that's been launched for you there, Matthew, and those responses are coming in. We'll give that a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close that now. Okay, so you can see there that actually a vast majority, so 80% of people do indeed have both. 15% have just business travel insurance and 5% just have the assistance provider there, Matthew. So I'm going to remove that off the screen for you, and you should have control.
Wonderful. Well, that's interesting, but not all that surprising. And I'll explain why in just a second. But before I do, I'd like to give everyone a brief introduction to Chubb. So Chubb is a company that, as Erica mentioned earlier, I have been a key member of the travel insurance team that sits within for the last 7+ years. It's been a very interesting and exciting experience working at Chubb, given that Chubb is the world's largest publicly traded property and casualty insurance company. We're a global insurance leader, and we have active businesses in just about every part of the world in the property and casualty space, in the accident and health space, in the life space, and our business focuses on both the corporate sector and consumer sector. Now, it is Chubb's privilege, of course, to participate and to help lead this discussion today. Now, back to the polling question for a second. We saw that the overwhelming majority of organizations that are participating in this discussion today have both for their employees travel insurance and travel assistance services. Now, there's a very important distinction to be aware of between the two. Travel assistance services are largely the components of risk protection that an employee touches and feels and experiences while traveling, and could include things like coordination of medical care at hospitals, evacuation, repatriation, and it could also include services that are a bit more real time, including help in emergency situations, concierge services, and coordination of emergency plans. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about an example of when emergency planning came into practice in a real life scenario that Chubb was involved with. Now, travel insurance is another form of travel risk protection and mitigation that's primarily focused on the financial losses associated with incidences while traveling. Travel insurance could cover financial losses related to medical expenses, the value of lost personal property, lost deposits that are incurred as a result of having to cancel a trip, or financial hardship incurred by a family as a result or following the death of a traveler. Now, what's interesting is as the poll confirmed, most travel insurance policies actually already include a lot of travel assistance services as part of the package that is purchased. So it's very uncommon in this day and age to have one without the other. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about insurance and the motivations that underlie insurance within an organization for travelers. First of all, the motive that is sort of pursued by an employer when they appoint an insurance company to provide coverage and services to their employees. The motives are threefold for the most part. Number one motive is duty of care, and we've through Carolyn's presentation have discussed what duty of care entails. Now, from an employer's perspective, obviously, duty of care is a duty to care for and to protect employees while traveling. In some contexts and in some geographies, it's a legal requirement to care for your employees, and in some jurisdictions it might not be, but it is certainly a moral requirement. Now, there's also an element of corporate risk management that underlies an employer's motive to provide coverage for its employees, namely the risk management associated with the fact that employees are important to organizations, and organizations big and small and everything in between cease to function properly without the right employees doing the right jobs. And as a result of an incident that could potentially occur during travel, a company might be in a worse off position from the perspective of not having that employee able to function at full capacity. So it's important to protect your employees because it protects, in turn, your organization. And the final key motive is companies like to provide coverage and support for their employees as an employee benefit, right? It is another form of compensation that an employer can give to an employee to protect them, both while they're traveling for work, while they're experiencing what travel brings to the table in terms of work, but also in terms of what travel brings to the table in terms of leisure in the Bleisure context. Now I'm going to talk about, from an insurance perspective, what you need to have in place. And basically the way I'm going to organize this segment of the conversation is we're going to talk about some of the key risks. We're going to talk about who those risks pertain to in both a business and leisure context. And then we're going to talk about the timing around the whole thing. When do coverages make the most sense? When do they need to apply? Again, both in the business and in the leisure context. So first of all, accidents are a key risk that are present and potentially frequent in the travel context, both business and leisure. Employees and travelers can die as a result of an accident, or can be permanently dismembered, permanently disabled, temporarily disabled, all as a result of accidents. Now, medical is also a key risk area. Employees, and travelers can get sick, can require medical attention as the result of an accident. Sicknesses can be serious or could be minor, but all may require treatment and might, yield and incur losses. Medical is obviously something that most people have coverage for when they're at home in their own, native environments. But when they're out abroad, especially, and in unfamiliar environments, medical can be much more complicated to find and seek out and pay for, obviously. Political and natural disasters are another risk grouping, very, very much present when people are outside of their areas of comfort, especially when they're traveling in different parts of the world where they might not be familiar with the political climate or with the natural climate. For example, I live in Miami, a city that is well known for its exposure to hurricanes. And we have a lot of people come visit us on both business and leisure. In fact, Bleisure as well. Miami is a very popular Bleisure destination, and are not really familiar with the fact that our hurricane season lasts for a number of months, and travel plans need to be made accordingly. Baggage and other personal property risks are also commonly present. The risk that your baggage is lost, damaged, or stolen, either while it's in possession of an airline, for example, or while it's within your own possession. And other personal property. People often travel for business with laptops and mobile devices, and these devices are often fairly valuable and easy to lose or steal or damage. And the loss might not be a personal loss to the traveler. It might actually be a loss to the organization as well, both in terms of the physical value and in terms of the content of what could potentially be saved on a hard drive, for example. Trip cancellation and curtailment is another key risk. What happens when an employee is supposed to travel and has made arrangements and has paid for those arrangements, but then cannot travel due to some unforeseen circumstances? That is a risk that needs to be taken into consideration. Personal liability, right? And this is key in certain parts of the world that are potentially a bit more litigious. Travelers, both representing a company or representing themselves, have the potential to incur serious losses, and it is a company's responsibility in many cases to provide support for that employee. And kidnap and ransom, a very, very clear and present threat in many less safe parts of the world, including many geographies that many of us have traveled to or have sent our employees to travel to. Now, in the Bleisure context, the question of coverage for whom is a bit more complicated than in the pure business sense. In the pure business sense, the company often is very aware of the fact that it needs to, under duty of care and its other motives, is going to have to provide coverage for the employee. But in the Bleisure context and in the context of the fact that companies are now engaging more formally in putting in place Bleisure policies that might allow employees to travel with family, friends, or other companions, it should be taken very seriously by these organizations that you might need to and have a duty of care to provide coverage for those family members, companions, and other friends as well. Now, again, in the pure business sense, when is a very easy question to answer as well. Well, when in the business context is when that person is traveling for business, but when Bleisure comes into the picture, those lines get blurred, and it should be taken with some care that the decision of when to provide coverage, and this should be discussed with your insurance company and with your brokers to make sure that you craft something that aligns well in terms of the when question with how you see Bleisure as per your employment procedures and policies. And it could include things like coverage during team building activities and in between weekends and leisure extensions both on the before and the after, and remote working time and maybe time at a second destination or even a third destination. That might not be the explicit destination of your business trip, but might be linked. Now, there are some exceptions and some areas that maybe as an organization you could and should consider not covering. So one key area to consider is, well, when a trip is really too much leisure and not enough business, then you need to explore as an organization whether the duty of care that you have for your employees really extends to this trip in question. Whether some activities are unduly risky. Now, Carolyn mentioned before that she swam with sharks. Now, in most contexts, that activity could be and should be covered by an insurance policy, but it is up to the employer to decide whether unduly risky activities in general should be covered, and to make sure that the insurance coverage that they purchase for their employees aligns with their view on what is unduly risky and what is not. And note that there are also, maybe some regulatory considerations to take into consideration depending on your geography as well. Whether an employee made arrangements with no employer involvement. We discussed before that 64% of Bleisure activities and travel is undisclosed. Now, an employer might take it very seriously, this topic, and ensure that trips need to be disclosed and Bleisure needs to be disclosed in order to provide the right and requisite coverage. And then obviously a company should consider that not all accompanying travelers necessarily need to receive coverage. It needs to be very, very selective and deliberate in who does and who does not. Now I'm going to talk about two quick case studies of which Chubb was involved that illustrate some of the concepts that we have discussed. The first one was Chubb was covering a large group of employees that were working on a longer term assignment. It was a week or two in Qatar. And at one point in time of this large group of employees, some were actually sitting and working at an office and some were out doing leisure. Given that it was a week plus, right, there was a weekend in the middle, and in Qatar, where they follow a different weekend than in the UK and most of Europe, there were some employees that were out enjoying the weekend and some that were working back on the Western Europe schedule. While this was all happening, the government issued a directive requiring foreign nationals to leave the country within 24 hours. So you have this big group of employees, some are here, some are there, some are working, some are out exploring and taking in what Qatar has to offer. And the company needed to with Chubb's participation, activate and coordinate to move all of these employees out of the country. Chubb helped with this coordination and coordinated with both managers on the ground and overseas via the Chubb Travel Smart app. Chubb covered the cost of all of the unexpected flights that had to be paid for to take these employees home, and Chubb's assistance provider had security services stand by to protect the employees as required. So that's one example. And the second example that I'll talk through is we were covering an employer that had one of its employees on a business trip in China, and this employee was actually in the middle of a Bleisure activity. In between meetings, the employee was sitting at a coffee shop when a thief came and stole the employee's bag. Now, fortunately, the employee did have his mobile device on hand and was able to, through the app, contact Chubb that helped coordinate the initiation of the claims process, where his laptop, glasses, clothes, and other personal items were covered in full. And as mentioned before, the laptop was actually property of the company, so the claim payment for this overall loss was split between the individual for the individual's personal possessions and the company for the laptop. And the claims payment was made very, very quickly. Now I'd like to turn it back over where we will talk about policies.
Thank you, Matt. That was very informative, and thank you for clarifying the situation on shark swimming. Although I've since read that somebody was mauled by a shark in that region just a couple of days ago. So, as Matt mentioned, there's no getting away from the fact that we need to talk policies. I'm just going to, there we go. So actually, there's potential here for huge legal grey areas, as we saw, and things will only become apparent when things go wrong, and reputations and potentially lives are at stake, and possibly in high-octane emotional circumstances with a lack of clarity on either side being needed. So what we know is that almost 90% of companies do allow Bleisure travel, but actually fewer than 15%, so we've got a higher percentile here in the group today, have this mentioned in their travel policies. And only 12% of business travellers are typically aware whether or not their company does have Bleisure as part of their travel policy. But also 27% weren't sure if there was a policy in place when they were taking a business trip, even though they had still participated in a leisure element of that trip, which is interesting. And only 3% of organisations actually look into the risk ratings for the Bleisure element of one of their employees or any of their employees' leisure activities. So there is an implication here that travellers are covered when actually they may well not be. So what we really are advising is a clear decision on whether or not Bleisure travel is or is not permitted within your organisation. And those Bleisure guidelines really need to have crystal clarity on what is covered by the company and what isn't. And it may well be that you want to make this destination specific. So you might decide that you will cover Bleisure travel in regions where you've got offices, but maybe not off-piste. You may decide that you're only going to cover Bleisure activities for a specific trip duration. You, of course, need to give some advice in terms of who people can call when things go wrong, and when people can and cannot use your travel risk management solutions. So can they use it during the business part of a trip, or could they also use it for a leisure part? Will it also include covering their family members? And you may decide or not to offer employee tracking, which I know is quite an interesting subject in the travel risk arena at the moment, whether or not, if you've got the ability to track employees when they're traveling on business, if you're going to offer that for the leisure element. And of course, being really clear about that duty of loyalty and making sure that employees understand what their obligations are as well, because ultimately what you want to avoid is A, the legal grey areas, but of course financial loss, litigation and reputational damage, and of course any individual any individual damages as well, or upset. So things that you might want to consider to support your Bleisure travellers is, of course, allowing Bleisure travel, because as we've seen, it does have benefits for yourself and your travellers. But also, if you do decide to offer Bleisure travel within your organisation, to encourage it and have your senior management lead by example. So have an open culture where people talk about the Bleisure elements and not be embarrassed to say that they have actually taken some downtime and looked after their physical and mental well-being. As we've just talked about, having those clearly defined policies, but also potentially extending the services of your travel management company and the hotel rates or the other rates that you have applicable on the business travel element to the leisure element as well. So again, everything is kept in one place. Also, of course, maybe allowing that collection of loyalty points and extending the services of travel risk management providers, such as, pre-trip travel things such as country risks reports and assessments, so that they can read them prior to taking on a Bleisure trip. And then, of course, consider insurance policies, which include a Bleisure element or the extending of business trips. I have seen a number of employees who've actually really gone the extra mile to support their business travellers. And so in a couple of instances, I've seen organisations who've extended the travel risk management provider for the leisure element, and indeed for employees' families who would be travelling with them. So insurance that covers both business and leisure travel. I've even seen employees give their employees SAP phones to take if they're going into remote areas, so that they've got that connectivity. That's what I needed in Tahiti. And again, that optional employee tracking. And also leisure travel risk assessments, because we saw only 3% of organisations currently were covering risk assessments for the leisure element. And again, those pre-trip country briefings and reports. And then, of course, preventative resources for accompanying family members. So again, that's maybe giving them some training, making things available to them, so that family members understand either if they're a trailing family member, so they're just accompanying someone on a business trip, they understand what they might be able to do in their own downtime whilst your employees are working, as well as when they're taking family downtime for the full sort of extended business trip, a city break or a holiday. So to conclude, as Erica said right at the beginning, Bleisure travel is on the increase, and there are benefits both to employers and employees. Your employees are likely to do it irrespective of whether it is allowed. And as we've seen, there are some gaping grey areas. We saw that with the 2 case studies that I talked to you about earlier, as to where support starts and ends. And lots of organisations don't have clearly defined policies around Bleisure travel. And that puts employers and employees at risk. But much of this can be mitigated through those clearly defined policies. So I'd just like to, before we finish off, thank everybody whose resources and sources we used to make today's webinar accessible to everybody, with all that information that we shared. And we're going to finish off with one more poll. So we'd like to know from yourselves, given the time that we've spent together this afternoon, will you be making any changes to your services, policies, or conducting Bleisure travel differently as a result of the information that we've shared with you during the last hour?
So that's been released for you. So that's as well. So if you're going to also conduct your Bleisure travel differently, if you're a Bleisure traveller, also select yes. So I'm going to give that a few more seconds. I'm going to close that for you now. Okay, so we can see here that, 50% say that they are. 34% are unsure, so they're probably going to have to do a bit more research into that. 16% say no, so they're obviously doing it all perfectly, which is amazing. So fantastic, thank you very much. Okay, so I would like to just take this opportunity to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. If you'd like to do so, you can do that through the question chat box there. A link to this recording will be shared with you, so please do look out for an email from me. Like I say, please do submit any questions that you've got through your question box. We'll come to those in a moment. I mentioned earlier that today's webinar is part of a series called Your Best Travel Self, and the subjects chosen have been put forward as key subjects from our travel community. They are delivered by industry experts and are suitable for all travellers. Now, we're currently reviewing ideas for what to deliver and for 2020, and we really appreciate your input into this. So in my follow-up email, I will be asking for your input into that. I would like to also say a massive thank you to our sponsors of this series, Chubb, and of course to Carolyn and Matthew for taking their time out of their busy schedule to prep for today's webinar for all of your benefit. So thank you to you, and of course for everybody that's taken the time to join it. I hope you found it a useful and beneficial use of your time. So I've got one question that's come in here. So just looking at this, I think it's probably going to be aimed towards you, Matthew. So if you can come back on the line. So they say, my company says that they do not cover us on insurance for outside of work time. I travel to London regularly and have to stay overnight on occasions. I don't want to just stay in my hotel room. So often I will meet a friend or go out for dinner on my own. If something happened during the evening, would my company's insurance cover me, even though they say quite clearly that they don't cover me outside of work time?
Good question. And the answer is, it all depends on what it says in the policy that your company is issued by the insurance company, and in what materials they share with you on that. And I would encourage that you sit down and speak to your HR department, be it a big HR department or a small HR department, and get a bit more detail and ask them for a copy of the insurance policy that covers the employees of the company that travel. Now, that being said, there are a couple of ways to handle the situation. So first of all, you could take the approach, if you figure out that you are not covered, of checking back at your home country with your local insurance regulator and your local your local employment fairness organizations, and confirm with them whether what your company is doing is appropriate and even within regulatory standards. And if you find out that you still are lacking the coverage that you believe you need to have to feel safe, and if you confirm that your company will not be able to provide you with that coverage, there is a massive market in most countries around the world for individual consumer travel insurance products that might be able to help fill the gaps in your coverage that you can buy for yourself.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Again, we've said before, it can be a bit of a grey area. So just in the interest of time, we'll leave it there. If there are any questions, please do feel free to reach out to us. Our contact details are on the screen now for you. We'd love to hear from you. As I mentioned, you will be receiving a follow-up email from me with various details in there for you to benefit from. So without further ado, I'd like to again say thank you to Carolyn and Matthew, and of course Chubb, for making this happen, and for all of you for investing that time in yourself as well. So without further ado, I would like to say thank you and wish you all a very fantastic rest of your day and safe travels. Thank you and goodbye.